funded by the National Arts Council and in collaboration with the Composers Society of Singapore. So the project is really to pay homage to pioneer composers and to chronicle the major accomplishments of the pioneer composers, especially after independence from 1965 to the early 2000s. So coincidentally, today our two speakers this evening will share the earliest work within our project in 1965, which is Kam Ki-yong's Kuang, Xiang, and in 2002, premiere in 2002, which is Bernard Tan's Piano Concerto. And so perhaps in one way, we are trying to identify a certain standard repertoire for Singaporean music in terms of large-scale works. So in this way, the younger generations will be able to learn and be aware of the historical achievements of our Singaporean composers, pioneer composers, through this public forum over the next over these 3 days, as well as online in the online database. So I've given liberty to the researchers to look at various aspects, various parameters within the orchestral works, as well as to create various creative impetus, creative repertoire that they have, that they will like through dance, music, and drawing, for instance. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers this evening together. So the first speaker is To Yen-yi. She's currently a third-year composition student at Yong Conservatory of Music. So she focuses on topics of nature, dualities, and dichotomies in her composition, and occasionally food as well. So she has always loved the arts, especially including the visual art, having started out with Chinese calligraphy when she was young. The second speaker this evening will be Angela Weihan, and she's presently a student at Seoul National University in South Korea. And she's deeply interested in human factors research, especially in the smart technologies for smart cities. Music composition for her is a second major for her course at the university, and is also a fond hobby of hers. So our format this evening will be about 20 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll move into question and answer. So over to you, Yen-yi.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here, joining us for today's presentations. So yeah, as Jin Kai has mentioned, I'm currently a third-year student at YST. And over the past few months, I've had the great joy and privilege of discovering the music of Kam Ki-yong, one of Singapore's pioneering composers, and particularly looking into his work, Kuang, Xiang, for solo violin and orchestra. So today, I will share more about his music and how I feel it has been monumental in its own ways. So first of all, I would like to give a short introduction to Mr. Kam, his early life and career in the arts. So Kam was born in Penang, Malaysia, into a musical family, and he grew up in the village of Jelutong, located right south of the Penang River. So from a young age, he was actually very much inspired by his father, who was a clarinetist, music educator, and also a leader of a jazz band. He first learned the violin at the age of 10 under his father, and he later studied with Mr. Louis Lim for 5 years. And during his youth, apart from performing very frequently with his father's band, he also started dabbling with improvisations on his violin. Aside from that, visual art has also been a very big part of Kam's life. It is something that he's always been passionate about and has been a significant source of inspiration for many of his pieces. And after a brief period of studying visual arts at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts here in Singapore, he went on to pursue a music degree in violin performance at the Royal Academy of Music in London. And it was during this time where he wrote his first pieces for string quartets, which were due to his experiences leading and playing in the string quartet setting, and this allowed him to begin taking composition lessons at the academy. So after his studies in London, he returned to Singapore and enjoyed a rather successful and diverse career as a composer, violinist, conductor, educator, and visual artist. He received several commissions both in Singapore and abroad, and he was awarded the Culture Medallion in 1984 for his contributions to Singapore's art scene. Of many of the pieces that Kam has written, I particularly focused on his piece, Kuang. This piece takes quite a few forms. It was originally composed for violin and piano in 1964, and it was premiered in the same year by the composer himself. Later in 1978, it was rearranged for solo violin, piano, harp, and percussion as a commission by the TOKK, or Tok Ensemble of Tokyo. And later this was arranged again for solo violin and orchestra in 2010 for a performance by the SSO featuring Kam Ding as soloist. And this was part of a concert titled Surpassing Beauty, where half of the program was actually dedicated to Mr. Kam Ki-yong's music, and Kam Ding was invited as solo violinist. And this is interesting because to date, apart from the late Cao Jie, whose music was covered yesterday, whose symphonic suite for large orchestra was performed by the SSO in 2000, Kam actually remains the only composer to receive such an honor, and no other local composer has had their music featured by the SSO in such a manner. So with that, I wanted to find out what about Kam's works may have garnered the attention of the SSO and what makes his music monumental in its own ways. So let's first break down the definition of monument, which is often referred to as something that's very grand and revered, and often of great historical importance. So for Singapore, monuments largely seek to preserve and or celebrate the past and present of life in Singapore amidst its constant growth and development. For many local artists during Singapore's post-independence period, and even to this day, they aim to capture the essence and culture of Singapore through their works, be it through paintings, sketches, music, and so on. And before this 2010 concert featuring Kam's works, several pieces by local composers were already performed by the SSO and Singapore Youth Orchestra. And these pieces were largely inspired by sights and sounds of Singapore and its local culture. Just to give a few examples, Pun Yu Tian's Variations on Dayong Sampan, David Campbell's Singapore Suite, and also Leong Yun Pin's Dance Suite, which actually builds upon material from Malay, Indian, and Chinese folk songs. However, most of Kam Ki-yong's works featured by SSO at this 2010 concert were actually not directly associated with Singapore or its local Chinese culture. Fantasia of Insects and Lao Jiang Xing, for example, were part of Tang Shi Yuan, a set of works that were based on Chinese poetry of the Tang Dynasty. In other works, The Surpassing Beauty was also inspired by ancient Chinese poetry, and works like Huai Gu and Kuang actually sought to reimagine scenes and music of ancient China. Furthermore, there's this quote over here that speaks about Karl Dahlhaus in the 19th century music book that mentions that musical monuments should also meet certain requirements in terms of its form and length. So in comparison with Symphonic Suite for Large Orchestra by Cao Jie, Kam's pieces, which were featured by the SSO, would have been on a smaller scale, not only in terms of instrumentation, but also its length. So some of the works featured, including Kuang, were originally for smaller chamber instrumentation before they were later arranged for orchestra for this concert. And in fact, with both Kam Ki-yong and his daughter, Ms. Kam Ding, being outstanding violinists, the majority of Kam's output and well-known compositions were written either for solo violin or violin and piano. So perhaps instead of evoking present-day sights and sounds of Singapore through his music, it was actually Kam's honoring of traditional roots by incorporating narratives from ancient Chinese poetry in some of the orchestral works featured by the SSO at this concert, or even evoking sounds of traditional instruments of China in Huai Gu. And Kam's approach is unique because it goes beyond reflecting on history and retelling stories of the past, but it also reacts and makes himself part of this history. Now, I'd like to share a brief analysis video which covers a few examples from Xiang.
To dig deeper into Kam's approach, we will focus on his orchestral work, Xiang, performed at the Singapore Symphony Orchestra's concert in 2010, where half of its program was dedicated to Kam's music. Before that, let's go back to where Kam's career as a composer took flight, during his studies at the Royal Academy of Music in London. As a violin major, Kam often had the opportunity to perform and rehearse in a string quartet setting. Speaking about his conservatory life in his 2010 interview with the National Library Board, Kam recalled that he approached his colleagues with the draft of his first piece for string quartet and asked if they would like to play music written by a Chinese composer, which was then met with great enthusiasm and interest, as they had never played nor encountered music by Chinese composers before. It is interesting to note here that Kam, as a young composer and artist, felt much more rooted to his racial and ethnic identity compared to his national identity. Despite having his second string quartet titled Malaysian, this strong connection to his traditional Chinese roots is evident in many of his later pieces, where he was inspired by ancient Chinese poetry or sought to evoke the melodic or timbral qualities of Oriental music. Xiang opens with a mystical, somewhat eerie atmosphere in the first 4 bars. The wood block, triangle, and gong lurk in with a steady metronomical figure over a tritone played by the piano, lower strings, and then the horns. The sound colours of this opening figure in the percussion section allude to rituals of East Asian Buddhism, where temple blocks and bells are commonly used. In this same opening passage, Kam also introduces the pitches G sharp, C sharp, and D sharp, or the scale degrees 5, 1, 2. While this set of pitches may have been selected to foreshadow the full pentatonic scale on C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, G sharp, and A sharp, or the scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, which Kam introduces in bar 5, it is worthy to note that G sharp, C sharp, D sharp was also, coincidentally or not, the opening melodic motif of Debussy's Pagodes, which was influenced by Javanese gamelan music of Indonesia, and presents a pentatonic sound world as an ode to the Pelok and Slendro modes of gamelan. What makes this association between Xiang and Pagodes less of a coincidence is the use of the piano. In the entire introductory section of Xiang, the piano holds low sustained chords, mostly in octaves. This use of extreme low registers can also be found in Pagodes, where Debussy writes long pedal tones in the lowest voice to signify the low gongs of gamelan music. Additionally, the wood block, earlier mentioned to allude to Buddhist rituals, is used slightly differently in bar 11, and in subsequent sections such as rehearsal mark B, where quicker accelerating rhythms liken to the beating of the bangu used in Peking opera. Furthermore, Kam takes the harmony and tonality of traditional Oriental music to another level in this piece. Following the introductory section, which cadences in F-sharp minor, a short quasi-cadenza passage by the violin suggests an A pentatonic scale in its first 2 bars, but later reveals itself only to be a subset of the entire G Lydian mode, which is the G major scale with a raised 4th degree. This passage is accompanied by harmonies centered around B minor. These different implied tonalities of the various instrumental forces hold similarities to Debussy's treatment of harmony, such as in the opening of his Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, where the implied tonality of the opening flute solo differs from that of the orchestral parts. Thus, from the opening of this piece alone, Xiang already presents distinct oral references to the music and culture of Asia. These aforementioned examples show how Kam reconceived Chinese or Oriental music to the context of a Western orchestral work. On the other hand, he had also reimagined the Western Rhapsody in a style closer to his traditional roots, and it is no coincidence that the English title translation of this piece is Chinese Rhapsody. In a recent interview where I had the opportunity to speak to Kam Ning, it was confirmed that the composer was also inspired by Ravel's Zigan, a legendary work with great violin showmanship, also known as the Gypsy Rhapsody. Xiang challenges the solo violinist with a range of demanding passages featuring techniques such as harmonics and double, triple, and quadruple stops, and these are also present in Ravel's Zigan. Furthermore, the violin's opening solo of Kuang also bears similarities to that of Zigan. Kam adapted some of these musical ideas from Zigan, while having more melodic and harmonic intervals centered around seconds, fourths, and fifths, which are common intervals used in Chinese music due to the pentatonic scale. These are just some examples on how Kuang was monumental in its own ways, and how Kam Ki-yong strived to take tradition to new heights.
Okay, so I hope that provides some insight into the ways that Kam has elevated these traditional elements and also reimagined this idea of the Western Rhapsody. So besides this, various techniques which were present in the violin solo in Zigan were actually also conceived similarly in Kuang. So next up, I want to present a side-by-side comparison video of how such ideas were used in both pieces. And with permission from both Kam Ning and Gabriel Lee, I'll be using recordings from Kam Ning's performance of Kuang with the SSO from Mr. Kam Ki-yong's YouTube channel, as well as Gabriel Lee's performance of Zigan with piano accompaniment. Okay, so as we can see over here, the opening violin solo passages of both Zigan and Kuang evoke a strong sense of grandeur alongside this use of repetition. And while Zigan centers its dramatic expression on a single melodic line in the beginning, Kuang becomes increasingly inviting to the listener with its rich addition of harmonies, for example, through double stops and quadruple stops. And the varied use of repetition is subsequently further explored for both pieces, with acceleration providing growth in musical momentum. And additionally, in these excerpts, Zigan integrates techniques of showmanship, such as harmonics and spiccato, a number of passages with ordinary playing. And it presents a short interlude solely with the pizzicato. So in contrast to Ravel's approach, Kam's Concerto actually features a passage which uses only natural harmonics, and as well as a passage using only a combination of spiccato and pizzicato, allowing these techniques to actually emerge into the forefront of the work. Yet, I do believe that Concerto is not a mere monument of Zegan, and while Ravel and Kam Ki-yong employed the same collection of violin techniques with similar modes of presentation, as well as similar intentions of expressing this sense of grandeur and monumentality through their pieces, it's quite clear that both of them have distinct methods and perspectives of adding color to each idea. So after evaluating these similarities and differences between Zegan and Concerto, I decided to compose a piece, a short piece, that incorporates aspects from both pieces, such as the various string techniques employed, as well as the harmonic language from Concerto. So this piece is titled Ode to the Sun. It was written for solo cello and in response to Kam's painting in 2004, titled with the same title. And I decided to compose this piece with the opening melodic motif of pagodes in mind. So instead of G sharp, C sharp, D sharp, the opening motif for my piece is G sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, or reordered as C sharp, F sharp, G sharp. So I had the great privilege of working with amazing cellist Zoe Ye, and with the help of our recording engineer, Kenneth Tay. And without further ado, I'd like to present a score video. Okay, and with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Yi, as well as Zoe, who is the cellist, and she's here with us this evening
Yeah,
as
she's
well.
here with us today.
Yes. Okay, and so we'll move on to Angela Weihan's presentation on Bernard Tan's Piano Concerto.
Hold on a moment, let me share my screen. Are you able to see? Oops, sorry, I think it's the wrong screen. Are you able to see my presentation slides? Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Angela, and I'm currently a computer science and music double major student in my third year. And today I'll be presenting on my analysis of how Professor Bernard Tan's Piano Concerto falls into this category of composing monumentality. And I would first like to thank Jin Kai for all of his guidance in this project, as well as Professor Tan, whom I believe is in this call also, for generously sharing the score to his work. So this is the outline of my presentation today. I will start off with an introduction to Professor Bernard Tan. Next, move on to talk about monumentality as an expression of musical colors, and finally end off with an artwork relating to this analysis. So first and foremost, Professor Bernard Tan is a composer and a physicist who was born in 1943. Tan is now a professor in the Faculty of Science, Department of Physics at the National University of Singapore. According to Offstage, a web publication by Esplanade, upon graduating with a doctorate in philosophy in engineering science, Tan returned to Singapore and became a physics lecturer and furthered his career in taking up various roles, such as the Dean of Science, the Head of Physics, as well as the acting head of the Department of Music. And above shown is his educational background. Next, I will talk about the musical journey of Tan. Tan started off with the classical piano, and with a lack of confidence as a pianist, he ventured into composing. Without formal training, he began writing anonymously for his church choir. Ferrara's article entitled Bernard Tan, The Science of Music had also compiled the works of Bernard Tan over the years, and it can be seen that his earliest published works were music for choir, such as Psalm 23, Serenade, and 3 Malay folk songs. The 3 Malay folk songs were clearly influenced by Singapore's social setting then. Other influences from his environment include his religious faith, where he had written more than 10 sacred works over the years. From around when he started composing in 1975 to date, as well as where he had lived, as noted by Pereira. As recorded in the list of published works also by Pereira, Tan began writing for chamber in 1976, but has only had large compositional output in the 1980s and 1990s. A vast majority of his orchestral works were also in the 1980s and 1990s, with works for celebratory events in the 2000s. This is not surprising, considering the Asian Composers League as a major turning point for Tan, where he described the composition he had presented as the most ambitious. Many of these works for violin, piano, guitar, and cello built and established forms such as the Sinfonietta and Overture, characterized by their tinge of ethnic music, as recorded by Project Idiom. So this is what Tan had described about his later relationship with music, which is how his background in physics relates to music. So Tan says that there's this cognate relationship between architecture and music because of the fact that for some reason or other, though we listen to music as a linear time sequence, the subtotal of a piece of music has the appearance in our mind or solidity of something that's built in space. And we talk about the palette, the balance in music, we talk about form in music, we talk about contrast and all that. It's just like how architects do. It's the same. The relationship of structure is very important because it's like architecture, and needless to say, architecture developed on geometry. So that relationship, architecture, geometry, and music is very, very strong. Back to this, in the same interview, Tan also shared that he was the acoustic consultant for the renovation of the Victoria Memorial Hall in the 1980s and the committee of the Esplanade constructions, as well as a lecturer of the science of music, where he taught students the relationship between music and mathematics. Now, I will move on to talk about monumentality as an expression of musical colors. So before delving straight into the piano concerto, let me first examine the idea of monumentality. Monumentality can be defined in many ways, two of which are as follows. So monuments are the expression of men's highest cultural needs. They had to satisfy the external demand of people for translation of their collective force into symbols. The most vital monuments are those which express the feeling and thinking of this collective force, the people. And this is noted by Sut et al. Monument today carries a double meaning, evoking size and durability on the other hand, and commemoration of memorial on the other. And this is by Scare. So the piano concerto can be analyzed based on the words symbols and memorial from these two definitions. The piano concerto can be analyzed based on symbols and memorial. These symbols and remembrance can be observed in the concerto through distinct musical colors and certain characteristics of late 19th century music. Monumentality as an expression of musical colors is communicated to listeners in these manners. More specifically, the analysis delves into four main features of the work that reflect the notion of being symbolic and memorable in its original form, thereby reflecting monumentality, and these are heterophony, rhythmic stratification, rhythmic displacement, and confabent melody. Heterophony and rhythmic stratification are textures common to many indigenous music, such as music of the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean traditions. For heterophony, gamelan music for rhythmic stratification. These textures can therefore be seen to be a symbol of many traditional Asian music. On the other hand, rhythmic displacement and confabent melody are compositional techniques that are better associated with the late 19th century music of the West. Rhythmic displacement can be associated with works of multiple composers such as Claude Debussy and Francis Poulenc, while confabent melody can be associated with the works of Arnold Schoenberg and Anton Webern. The aforementioned techniques used by the aforementioned composers were significant in defining many pieces of the late 19th century and early 20th century, positioning these techniques as symbols of the era before today's. First, I will be talking about heterophony. A heterophonic texture is the simultaneous variation of a single melodic line where a variation of the melody is played over the original melody, and this definition comes from the BBC. This is a musical texture that is common to traditional Chinese music of the Jiangnan Sizhu and Guangdong origins, as well as other forms of Asian tradition, such as those from Indonesia, Japan, and Korea. This can be heard in moments when it sounded as though the instruments are playing in unison, but not quite the same. Some instruments will add slight elaborations to the melody, or perhaps even explore rhythmic diminution and augmentation through the repeated notes. A prominent example of heterophonic texture in this work is found in the Bass 213 to 215, where the same melody is heard in the piano and string parts at the same time. However, they employ different instrumental techniques in the execution of their parts, as noted in the figure above. This effect is also heard in other places of the work, most particularly in the 2D sections, where the orchestra presents the main themes of the piece. The inclusion of such a texture device in the piano concerto is unsurprising, as it is also being employed in the traditional music of many Asian cultures. However, one difference lies in the limited techniques and elaborations that the orchestral instruments can present within the context of the concerto. Here, monumentality is seen through the way in which an indigenous and unique feature of many traditional ethnic music is implemented in this piano concerto. Next, I'll be talking about rhythmic stratification. Rhythmic stratification, also called layers, results when two or more voices move at different but closely related levels of rhythmic activity. One voice may contain mostly quarter notes, or others may contain eighth notes. This is somewhat like different parts of a moving machine at different but related speeds. Layering is an important feature of polyphonic texture. Rhythmic stratification is common to gamelan music. Following the World Expositions in Paris in the early 20th century that featured music from Asia, many European composers made exploration into the use of rhythmic stratification in classical Western works. In the above extract from the piano concerto, the composer explores rhythmic stratification similar to that found in Debussy's music, as well as traditional gamelan ensemble. Instruments in the lowest and highest registers have respectively the lowest and highest rhythmic frequency. Correspondingly, the instruments in the middle voices perform at a higher rhythmic frequency than the ones lower in range. One prominent difference between Tan's use of rhythmic stratification in comparison with Debussy's or traditional gamelan ensembles lies in the timbre or tone colors, as we can call it. The gamelan ensemble comprises mallets and other percussive instruments, while Western composers who attempt to incorporate gamelan influences into their compositions often employ percussion instruments or other hammer-based instruments, such as the piano. In Tan's case, however, the stratified lines are played by the strings, which gives it a different musical and timbral effect. Rhythmic stratification, a common technique and feature of gamelan music, is used monumentally in orchestration of the piano concerto. Thirdly, I'll be moving on to talk about rhythmic displacement. Rhythmic displacement is a feature common to many Russian pieces, where composers deliberately alter the way musical time is perceived. This can be done either through changes in time signature or through changing the groupings of notes. In addition to the 3+3+2 quaver rhythm in the piano part as shown in the figure above, slight rhythmic displacement can also be seen in how motivic cells are being repeated in the piano and first violin parts. The once again revitalization of musical techniques of prior composers, and in this aspect the intelligent use of rhythmic techniques that was common in works of the late 19th century, brings out the monumental aspect of this composition. Finally, I will be speaking about Klangfarben melody. Klangfarben melody is a mosaic-like treatment of materials in which composers either split up a musical phrase to be played by different instruments or juxtapose different musical ideas linearly. This was most popular at the turn of the century when the Cubism movement in the visual arts was prominent. In the piano concerto, melodic ideas get imitated by one another. The phrases are often short and fleeting, as seen in the diagram above. Albeit analytically complicated, listeners are transported from one idea to another masterfully as the music transits between sections of tensions and resolutions. Klangfarben melody is a distinct technique, and its use often does not go unnoticed. Monumentality lies in the creative use of the melody through which the idea manifests and is developed in this piece. Tan's piano concerto showcases many colors and flavors, with origins that may be traced to music of different cultures, traditions, and regions. The utilization of different flavors splendidly combined creates a new flavor and taste to the work. The rhythmic and melodic techniques act as memorable symbols, so much so that listening to this piece of music has become a pleasure for me. Most specifically, the work showcases monumentality through the ways in which musical colors were expressed through a multitude of different techniques that were notable traits of music of predecessors. Now, I will move on to art, based on the piece. I think for many of us, music students or composers, we hear and see other fellow composers writing works based on art. But I thought it would be interesting to explore the opposite. Hence, I came out with this idea for the creative work as part of this project. In the diagram above, you can see the prominent melodic motifs present in this piece. Motifs that were given similar colors, example 1A and 1B, refers to motifs that are similar in musical idea or perhaps even almost identical. Same for 2A and 2B. With that, I marked out the presence of these motifs in every bar of the piece, and you can see in the diagram above. It might be a little small, but I hope you get the essence of how this was done. Finally, this creative artwork is an amalgamation of the analysis of the colors as well as the presence in the piece. The former is about how music of different flavors can be seen through the music, giving it an interesting musical color, while the latter analyzes how the melodic motifs morphs and gets reinstated through the work. So the idea behind this creative product is not only bringing together the ideas behind the two texts, the text as well as the Excel diagram, but also illustrating the piece's density, that is to show parts of the orchestral texture where it is the thickest. The creative process is as follows. A color palette is chosen, and each color in the palette is used to represent each theme that has been presented earlier. Next, it has been broken down into 50 bars, groups of 50 bars. The idea of how this creative piece is to overlap the colors formed from the 6 groups. Step 2 is done, color by color, starting with green. So if we go back to this diagram, you can see the groupings, and it is done group by group, starting with the color green each time. And yeah, so the colors will overlap, and this is done group by group. As for the ways in which the other colors are chosen, there is no particular order since the overall textural effect is the same. And when that is all done, a final background color is added. I hope the explanation didn't confuse you by too much. And that is all from me. If anyone has any questions, I would gladly take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela. That is very exciting to convert all the musical motif into a graph diagram for visually appealing to us. Okay, so we'll open up the floor to questions. I hope composer Bernard Tan himself is impressed or surprised at how we transform your musical idea into visually analysis. So if there's anyone amongst the audience who would like to ask any question to either of our speakers on the works of Kam Ki-yong's Kuang, Xiang for violin and orchestra, and Bernard Tan's piano concerto. Perhaps in the I'll start off with a question on. It appears that the two works focuses on structure. The two researchers have a leaning towards focusing on the structure of their respective works. Could you say a bit of why do you see that the structure of the materials become a very prominent feature for when you look at the idea of monumental compositions?
I can go first. In terms of structure, I think what really made me think about structure is because of Tan's background. Like I had shared earlier, he's a physics professor. And to me, like as a science and arts student, I think when you study the sciences, there is a lot of structure and reasoning to everything that you try to explain. And I think Professor Tan, his works are monumental because of his background, and I'm sure his background has a large effect on the way his works are being written. Hence, with in mind his background, and I decided that perhaps structure is an important feature of the work, most especially to bring out monumentality.
Okay. Actually, as for my research, I actually focus more on the little details, like the musical ideas that were presented in Kam Ki-young's Kuang, Xiang. And it was through these little ideas that I could draw relations to, let's say, traditional elements, or how he decided to reimagine certain ideas that were present in, for example, Ravel's Zigan, which he took inspiration from. So yeah.
Thank you very much. So for some of us who have not heard the music before, I've keyed in the YouTube links to both the piano concerto by Prof. Tan, as well as Kam Ki-young's Kuang Xiang in the chat. Perhaps Zoe would like to say something about the composition. Or Yenny would like to comment about the composition with.
Oh, I had a lot of fun working with Zoe on this. Yeah, and I guess maybe I'll talk a bit about like the composition, if you would be interested. Basically, maybe I would like to share my screen again, so that we can take a look at the artwork that I was inspired by.
Yes.
I did not use all the details that I found in the artwork as inspiration for the score, but the work is generally in this very loose ternary form, and I take it from this how I analyze the colors, the presentation of colors horizontally. So for example, on the left and right, we see like a lot of these yellow and green elements, and in the middle there's this bright red, almost flame-like color. So for me, this like bright red color is represented by these rhythmic figures that I had on the cello. And for the yellow and green, I imagine it to be a very warm tone, a very expressive, lyrical kind of tone on the cello. So that's largely how this piece was conceived. And I wrote this for solo cello because both Concerto and Zegan featured the use of the solo violin, and I thought it would be interesting to reimagine it on an instrument that was not the violin. So, and I'm currently just a beginner at the cello, so I thought I would write a piece for cello, and it was really fun to have my piece played, and it was a great honor to have it played by Zoe. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing how the transformation from the visual art into a new composition by yourself. So perhaps the cellist herself would like to share how the composition was something creative and unique for her, having played and premiered many compositions by Singaporean composers such as Jin An and Chan Yi. Would you like to
Hi. Hi. I really enjoy. Hi everyone. This is Zoe and Zero. I really enjoy this piece because of like just how she plays around like with the harmonic. I enjoy all the harmonics because like it creates a very like unique kind of sound. Especially, for example, there's a C sharp and then there's G sharp harmonic and then change to D to F sharp. Like the chords itself like sounds really pretty. And the piece itself, like the structure is quite simple, but I think the middle section was a lot of fun for me. What else do I like? I also quite enjoy the I also enjoy the from the transition from, you know, non-vibrato to vibrato. And because I discussed with composer, and I think she has a very clear view of, you know, which part she wanted to stay just like without any vibrato, and then the transition. So yeah, overall it's a really great and fun working process, and it's a honor to, you know, like be part of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing. Yes, the harmony came across as rather distinct in the sense that we are continuing to use pentatonic scale or pentatonic harmonies in our music, whether from the pioneer composers themselves as well as the young composers today. So Chen Jing would have 2 questions to ask. Please speak through your microphone.
Hello. It's early morning. I don't really look very good, so I'll probably keep my video off.
Thanks for joining us in the morning.
Oh no, it's very, very interesting, and I hope to hear more of these in future. And yeah, very great presentations by both of you. I have 2 questions, one for Angela and 2 for both. For Angela, right, you've given a very meticulous overview of the techniques present in Professor Bernard Tan's concerto and how he engaged with each of them. I'm wondering, in your own opinion, with regards to how he maneuvers these materials, what do you feel like is his own distinctive voice in his work and in general in his music? And then for both of you, how do you think both of these works relate to Singapore's overall creative landscape in the time they were being created or written? Yeah, thank you.
I'll go first on the first question on how Professor Tan maneuvers between the different musical motifs. I think one thing that makes it really very uniquely his work is the way he wanted and
Okay, so we seem to have
no, we lost her.
lost her. And okay, she's back. One more time.
sorry, I think my Wi-Fi was quite bad. Yeah, so as I was saying, I think what makes it uniquely his work is how the motifs transits very smoothly from one motif to another motif or to a counter melody. Musically speaking, I think it's the choice of intervals and notes. He would have a few intervals that he uses more frequently, and he uses that as like a pivot in order to move to other sections of music or other motifs, or to slowly transition into other motifs. I think the entire work is very, very fluid, and that is something that's very characteristic about this work of his, as well as, yeah, to make it uniquely his work. Should I go on about the second question, or Yanni, do you wanna answer?
Okay, I can. Maybe I'll speak briefly because and it's like quite an interesting question. I never really thought about that, but I would say though how I feel Mr. Kam Ki Yong has not only express this idea of monumentality, but also gives us something to learn about the landscape of music in Singapore. Is also that music does not necessarily need to be inspired by, let's say, the sights and sounds that you're surrounded by, or daily life experiences, which I'm very sure all of us know many pieces which are inspired by life experiences and daily happenings. And for him, one thing that I really liked about his works is that he really placed himself in this history and ancient Chinese poetry that he was so fond of, and he put himself in this poetry and, let's say, reimagined the inflections of the words in poetry as sound, as music, and through many other ways that he devoted himself into a particular topic, in this case ancient Chinese poetry, ancient Chinese music, which he felt was a very big part of his own culture, and reimagining it for a Western orchestra setting, which I thought was very interesting.
Answer to the second part of the question, which is about in relation to Singapore's development at that time, I believe. So is that right? I think so. Okay, so year 2002, I think that's when we were just born. Yeah, so for Yanni and I were just newborn babies, little kids. And I think at that time Singapore, it was still establishing itself in the larger world landscape. At that time, I think Singapore was still not as advanced in many areas. We still had to deal with the whole concept of religious harmony and just transiting from that kampong to HDBs. And yeah, so I think in this transitory phase, the work, which has a lot of Asian elements, kind of represents society. It shows how our society is being weaved together by different cultures. That's what I feel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so one point I realized was the monumentality and memorability are not only in the structural aspects within the composition itself, but also on a longer timeline from traditional Chinese as well as traditional Western musical inspirations. So it's quite a long trajectory. Is there any question from anyone within the seminar this evening? Okay, so in this sense, we'd like to thank everybody. I'm just going to share the website where some of the materials have been prepared and presented over the course of the last 6 months. You'll be able to see, if you click on the link, you'll be able to see some of the essays and analysis that our 6 researchers have prepared and over the past 6 months, with the encouragement of the Composers Society of Singapore and supported by the National Arts Council. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you again tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. for the final 2 talks by Leah Davison on Leon Yunpin's choral music and Kenneth Tay on Pun Yu Tian's Confucius cantata Hua Yu. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to Yan Yi and Angela.